much. All right, thanks everybody for joining. I am Nick Brattoli, and we're going to be talking about creating printable reports with Office 365, Power Automate, Power Apps, and some forms. But let me get a little bit of cleanup out of the way first. Sorry, I've got so many monitors everywhere. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen after thanking the sponsors. I think there are more sponsors than what's up here currently, but we can't do this without them. All right, let me actually share my screen now really quick. And there. Okay, so let me do an introduction really quick, and then I'm going to spend a lot of time doing demos. This slide deck is more for a guide after the fact for quick reference, but everything I'm going to show you today is going to be done kind of in not necessarily real time, but live. All right, so quick introduction about myself. My name's Nick Brattoli. I live in Birmingham, Alabama. I work as a principal consultant. That's SharePoint, Office 365, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI, kind of all of the whole Office 365 suite at a company that I'm a partner in called 365 Consulting. I'm also currently an MVP and a Microsoft certified trainer, again, around all of the same stuff that we're talking about. Interests include migration of SharePoint, modernization, that's modern SharePoint, so if you have any questions about that, Power Platform, the whole Power Platform, and in my spare time I like to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which unfortunately I can't do right now due to obvious circumstances. You can't be in somebody's face. Okay, so if you're on this session, you've probably had this question before from various users. They want to make a form that someone can fill out and you can print. And right now you may be doing this in a Word document or Excel that gets sent around. And in my experience, those don't usually work very well. So there is a solution. And how does that solution look? Well, it's easy. Someone puts information in somewhere, then some stuff happens, and then you have PDFs at the end, right? Super straightforward and easy. Well, we're actually going to dive into it over the next hour into how you can do all of that. And we're going to be talking about a few different ways to do it because, like everything, there are multiple ways of doing it. All right, I didn't realize these were all clickable bullets. Sorry about that. Let me go ahead and pop them open. All right, so we're going to be talking about your inputs. That's going to be your entry form of choice. We're going to talk about making individual reports. So that would be I fill out a form. It has this amount of information on it. And then the form I filled out gets printed out. And then we're going to talk about summary reports, which is going to be 10 people filled out this form. And I want to get a report of all 10 of those. So we're going to go over that, and then we're going to talk about some advanced features as well. I've got some little surprises here and there to show you that will be really cool, but the goal of this is to give you different building blocks that you can move in and out of your various solutions, because I've actually done multiple versions of this solution with different use cases for different clients over the last year or so, and just the building blocks are very important, so I want to focus on those. So again, there's going to be a lot of demo. Let me get through a couple more slides, and I'll try to answer questions along the way when I can. I'm not going to be monitoring them religiously, but I'll try to answer anything that comes up. Okay, so first thing I want to do is talk about what your options are for inputs. We're only going to focus on the first two on here. I'm going to actually demonstrate using Microsoft Forms or Power Apps, but you can also use customized SharePoint list forms, which again is kind of like Power Apps, but it's not a standalone. You can do that. You could make custom SharePoint framework forms that push into a SharePoint list, and that would work for this. Or you could even make something completely custom if you want and send it to Azure SQL or really any kind of backend that you can surface using Power Automate. So as long as you have that information in a format that Power Automate can read, you can do all the stuff that I'm about to show you. We are going to talk about some pros and cons for these first two options, though. First thing, forms is probably the quickest way to do this. Let's see, come on up here. Okay, so forms is going to be the quickest way to do this and the quickest learning curve. So just anyone can make a Microsoft form. You can show somebody in 5 minutes how to make one of these, and I'm going to show you an example of one that I made in a second. But it's very fast and easy. You could do it in about 5 minutes to make whatever form you're trying to make, as long as it's not too complicated. You could do it with Microsoft Forms. It's compatible with Power Automate, just like everything else that we need today. It can be embedded, so you can put it in a SharePoint site or a web page, or really anywhere that can take embed code. But more importantly, you can have anonymous access. On the other options we're going to talk about later, you can't necessarily do that. So if you want a form that somebody just on the internet can fill out and then you want to make something printable out of it, you can do that using Microsoft Forms. It does have limited functionality. There are some advanced things that I'm going to be showing you on Power Apps today that you absolutely cannot do in Forms. And of course, there's going to be other limitations there. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and look at some of those limitations, and then I'm going to show you an example of each. So Power Apps is super cool in that it hooks into a lot of different connections. You can hook it into SharePoint, or like, I don't know, there's like 270 or something like that connections you can hook Power Apps into to store your data. So if you don't like SharePoint, if you don't want to use SharePoint, like I'm going to do in my example today, you don't have to. You can still do a lot of the stuff that I'm going to show you using an Azure SQL backend or some other system. Dynamics, right? Power Apps, you could do something from Dynamics with it, right? So there's a lot of options with Power Apps that you don't have using Microsoft Forms. And you also have advanced functionality like pen inputs, which I'm going to show you how to use a little bit later. But Power Apps can just do way more things than Microsoft Forms can do. You've got variables, you have functions, and all kinds of ridiculous things, some of which I'll show you. A downside to that is it has a steeper learning curve. When you hear someone talk about Power Apps, to talk about a citizen developer is not just any user, it is a more advanced user that's taken the time to learn this. You don't have to be a professional developer to use Power Apps. I certainly am not. I'm the world's worst developer, but there is a steep learning curve to do some of this stuff. Another downside is that there is no anonymous access in Power Apps currently. There's a thing called portals that there are some sessions around where you can do that, but for the Canvas app that I'm going to be using today and focusing on, you can't really do anonymous access. So let's show you some of the forms real quick that I made. And right now I've got a SharePoint site that we can ignore. For now, I've actually got both forms on here, but this is a form I made in Microsoft Forms. It took me, again, about 5 minutes, maybe less than 5 minutes. There's only 3 options on here. The example we're going to use today is for an inspection of some sort. Maybe it's a safety inspection. Maybe you need to do equipment inspection. The real life use case was that the safety department for one of my clients has a bunch of inspections they do and through a bunch of people, and they want to make reports off of all of that. So we didn't use forms for this, but you could. So this is a basic form. They want title or whatever other field you want. It's basically a couple text inputs, an inspector name. It is not tied to a person or anything. It's just text, and a multiple choice, issue 1, pass, fail. You could have more questions than that. They can be in depth. You can put ratings and stuff in there. But for our purposes, you only need to have these few fields so I can show you how to push them into our flow that we're going to build later. Very easy to build. I'm not going to show you how to build this form, but it's simple. It can go into anywhere and you can share it with anyone. The Power App is a little more complicated than that. This, I'm not going to show you all of the features yet, especially this signature stuff. We're going to talk about that more in depth later, but I basically have the same fields on here as I had before. This is a Power App Canvas app that sits on top of a SharePoint list, and all of this data is pushed into SharePoint. Let me make sure, well, I'll go to questions in a second. So this all pushes into SharePoint. It has the same fields. Again, it's got a title. I did put a default value into that title using Power Apps. It's a lot easier to do in Power Apps than in Microsoft Forms. Inspector is no longer a text field. It is a SharePoint person field. So you can actually do a lookup on a real person and you can pull back a lot more information about them versus just having a text value. The item 1 is the same thing. It's a multiple choice. You have a pass or fail. Again, this is just going to be your questions or your checklist for whatever inspection you're doing. And down at the bottom, I have some cool signature stuff that I'll talk about later, and a submit button. So that's all I did to build the form. Again, you can use any kind of input form you want as long as it's compatible with Power Automate, and I'll show you the triggers and stuff and how you tie them together a little bit later. One nice thing about Power Apps is you can talk directly to a flow in Power Automate with Power Apps. You can have buttons and fields and stuff that go back and forth. We're not going to dive too deep into that, but it's just another advantage over using that. Okay, so we have our input source. Our input source is not going to change throughout the duration of this presentation. It's always going to be one of these forms putting the data in. What we decide to do with the data after the fact is what can change. So let's go back to our slide deck. Talk about the next thing. And the first thing we're going to talk about is how can you make a printout of an individual form item that's been filled out. And you need the following things to do so. You need an input source, which we just talked about. Power Apps are what I used for the full demonstration, but again, any of those other choices are fine. An HTML template, we'll go over how that's built in a second. It's very simple to do. You don't have to be a web designer to do it, but it does always help to know HTML. There are so many different situations where knowing HTML can come in handy. You need OneDrive. You cannot get around this. OneDrive is needed to be used for the action we're going to take in the Power Automate flow a little bit later. So you have to use OneDrive. SharePoint is 100% optional. I like SharePoint because you can store everything together and make it all nice and pretty and display it how you want. So in this demonstration, I did that, but I'll talk about it along the way, how you can ignore SharePoint completely and just do all this through Power Automate or Power Apps or whatever backend you're using. And finally, all the heavy lifting is going to be done by a flow created in Power Automate. I know that's confusing. Power Automate used to be called flow. Now flow is a lowercase item or feature application that you can make inside Power Automate, which now does a lot more things. So the first thing we're going to do is build our HTML template. We already have our input source, so we already know what our fields are. So that makes the HTML template a lot easier to build. Let's take a look at this. I could just pull up Notepad or Visual Studio Code where I built this, but it's easy enough just to put on a slide. It's very straightforward. If you're not familiar with HTML, I'm just going to very quickly point out what these are. These things are called HTML tags. They basically describe the pieces of a web page, or in this case, a PDF that we're going to be building, because our convert function is going to convert from HTML to PDF in the future. HTML, that designates this as an HTML document. Body means everything inside here shows up on the page. And then I also have a slash body and a slash HTML. That just means everything between these tags are what we really care about. And that's these 3 lines. And on these 3 lines, you can see the fields that I had on those forms that I just showed you. There's a field for title. These are just labels. You can make them say whatever you want. They don't have to match they don't have to match your field names or anything. Okay, same thing with inspector and issue 1. And then next to it, this is what we care about in this document, are these little squiggle brackets. You see the squiggle brackets with title, inspector, and issue. These are our placeholders for the information contained in our fields and our items inside of our form. So when we run our flow later, these things are going to get replaced with real information. So we make this very, very short HTML file. We save this again in our editor of choice, Notepad, whatever, as a .html file, and then we put it somewhere. In my case, I put it in a template library in SharePoint that I'll show you a little bit later. You could also put it in your own OneDrive for Business because it just needs to be accessible somewhere by the flow. Okay, so that's that. And so I have that in there. The next thing to configure is OneDrive. That's very easy. Hopefully you have access to your own OneDrive. But the way that it works is you need it for that convert file action that I just mentioned earlier. It's going to be used as temporary storage for a different HTML file that we're going to talk about before it gets converted into a PDF. What I like to do is create a separate folder inside my OneDrive for just that temporary HTML files, name it whatever you've named this project or your form. That way, when you're creating that, you know it's always going to be in the same folder. If you decide to get rid of the solution later, you can delete the folder, or if it doesn't delete, you know where it would be. So just make a folder inside your OneDrive, whatever account is creating the flow that we're going to build in a little bit, so that you can do that temporary storage. And I'm not going to demo that or anything. You can, if you're syncing to your desktop, do it on your desktop. If you want to do it in your browser, do it in your browser. Not a problem either way. You just have to have access to the OneDrive. All right, SharePoint. This is, again, optional, but I actually lean on SharePoint a lot in this solution because the real solutions that I built around here were built in SharePoint on purpose. But we're building a few different pieces in SharePoint, and I will show you what those are. We have an item list, a template library to hold that HTML template we just made, a report library, and a signature library that I'll talk about a little bit later. Let's take a look at it really quick though. So on my demo site, again, here are my pieces. So I've got an inspection form list, and that again has the titles, the different fields from my form that I built. You don't have to worry about the signature code. That's something we're gonna get into a little bit later. But essentially, here's a bunch of items that I filled out with forms using a Power App that just went straight into my SharePoint list. Okay, we have our HTML templates library that has 3 HTML templates in here because I'm actually going to show you 3 different templates today. And that's going to be what our report looks like. When I said we need to make that HTML template, that whatever we put in there is what's going to show up on the PDF at the end. So you can do other things. If you're an advanced HTML person and you want to put colors and tables, and inline CSS styling, you can do all of that and make really pretty reports. And I'll show you some prettier ones later. All right, and then I've got different libraries to hold all of my reports that I'll show you after they get created. And then, like I said, I've got a document library that shows images of the signatures if you wanted to take that for whatever reason, which I will show you how I did. So our SharePoint site is set up to hold all of our information. Let me stop for a second and look at this Teams. Are there any questions? Is it going to be recorded? That is a good question for the producer. I did, however, share the slide deck for this, so if you can get a hold of the slide deck, it kind of outlines how to do all of this. Okay, back to it. We've got SharePoint set up. Now let's start to go into the fun stuff and do the heavy lifting. Power Automate. We are going to make a flow. And I'm just going to go through this really fast on the slide and then show you how I really did it. Because again, this is more for your reference after the fact if you try to build it yourself. Okay, so this is in general the whole process the flow is going to take. I'll show you on the next page a picture of it, and then we're actually going to dive into the individual items. But essentially, you have a trigger of some sort, and then it pulls information from the item, looks at that item versus the HTML template, does some magic with it, makes a PDF, makes a file in a SharePoint library, and then deletes the file when we're done. Let's look at what this actually does and how it's built, because I'm sure that was very confusing looking at it as a bulleted list. Okay, here's a quick picture. Again, when you look at the slide deck later, it'll be easier to reference. I'm just going to jump into the actual flow. And first thing I wanted to go over is if you used a form instead and you still want to use my SharePoint solution, you still want to keep everything in SharePoint, or if you want to ignore SharePoint, this right here these are just a couple actions to bring that information from that Microsoft form into SharePoint instead. So this is a form trigger. When that form is submitted, pull the details out of it and then push those details into SharePoint. That's what I'm doing here. But really, if you have it trigger on submission and then get the details, you can ignore SharePoint completely and just do all the conversion stuff after this. I just wanted to show those of you who might use forms for this that you can start your flow this way. We're going to use a different trigger, so I'm going to show you this other flow instead. I actually have manual triggers on all the flows that I'm going to kick off today. So I would do it from a selected item on the SharePoint list, but you could have it triggered by the Power App. You could have a submit button trigger it. You could have it trigger automatically when an item appears in the SharePoint library. That's what you would do most of the time. But I wanted to be able to manually kick these off so I can choose which of the 3 flows I'm going to show you. So I have manually selected. When that happens, again, you can use any one of those other triggers that I just talked about and nothing else would change. But after you trigger it, I need to get that information from that item. So I'm looking at my inspection demo site. It's right here. I'm looking at this list, the inspection form list. I'm sorry, let me close this out of the way. I'm looking at the inspection form list, and I'm getting the ID from the trigger or from whatever other trigger you use. So I'm now pulling these fields from this list. Okay, so let me go back to my flow. And after I have that information, there's a couple things that I want to do. I'm going to compose. I'm going to use compose action a lot. For those of you who aren't familiar with this action in a flow, it basically just writes stuff. It just makes text of some sort for you. So right now I'm putting in the created date from this SharePoint item, the inspector name. I'm using their display name. You can also use their email address or whatever else you pull from that. And I'm adding a dash no signature to know that this report that I'm making is not going to include a signature. The more advanced one I'm going to show you a little bit later does have a signature. This is just the title. You don't need to do this step at all. You can always give it the report the same title, or you can give it a different title. There's lots of things you can do here. But I have a name for my report that I'm creating. I have the content for my report. Now I need to mash it into that HTML template that I made before converting it. This is where it starts to get, I wouldn't say tedious, but it gets involved. There's a lot of steps. The more fields you have in here, the more times you're going to have to do this step. But the nice thing about it is it's basically a loop. And I have the command on the PowerPoint deck that will show you what that loop is. But essentially, what we're going to do is we're first going to use a get file content from my HTML template. Again, it's stored over in my HTML templates folder. It is this no signature individual one. So here's the address, that's the site it's on, and here's the file itself. If you're storing the file in OneDrive instead, use a get file content OneDrive action. But it works exactly the same way, it's just a different source that you're pointing to. So now, Power Automate knows what that HTML file looks like that I just made. Remember, it's full of all those little squiggle brackets that have our field names in it. Below here, I also initialized a variable of HTML content. I had the content get spit out from this action into the next one, so that when I do troubleshooting, I can look at what it set this to, and I can do other things to it if I want. There are some more advanced solutions you may do with this, where you might want to have this file, this HTML content put into a variable so that you can do other things to it along the way. But again, this is optional. You don't have to use this step. Next, we have all of these compose actions, and this is where you do all of the heavy lifting. Again, the more fields that you have on your form, on your item, the more of these composes you have to build. What they do, again, they're writing text. What text are we writing? We are writing HTML, because at the end we want to have an HTML file that has the values in it that we need so that we can turn that into a PDF that has our data. So I'm using a compose. I want to compose the title. That's one of the fields we had, right? And I'm going to look at what my inputs are for that, and I used an expression. So you have to add dynamic content, but instead of being on this dynamic content tab, I'm on the expression tab. And this is what I have. It's very small. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the slide deck instead. But what I'm doing is using this replace function. You can see in purple, the replace is the function we're using, or the expression. And then what you're replacing is what just came from above it. So the first one would actually be the output of the HTML, the get HTML content. And then the next thing is where inside that content do you want to replace? So right now I have, this one's the one below the title. So this one's replacing inspector. So it's pulling the output of title. That's going to be whatever title spit out. It's going to replace inspector. And then what's it going to replace inspector with? It's going to replace it with the display name. So the field that's inside my item. So let's go back to our flow again and look at that. So this one again is actually pulling from the HTML template, the get file content. So replace, it's actually looking at the variable that I made, this initialized variable HTML content. So inside that, it's going to look just like that code I made. It's going to look for the squiggle brackets with the word title in it, and it's going to replace all of that with the dynamic content. I did not know how, I don't have these memorized. I don't know to type body, get item, inspection, all that stuff. What you do is after this comma, click on dynamic content and just find it from here. See, I just click it and it fills all that in for you. So once you have this made once, it's very easy to copy and paste. All you need to know is that it flows like a chain. So first thing I'm doing is I'm taking this HTML template. We've got 3 fields on here that have squiggle brackets, and we're coming down to this first compose. It replaces 1 squiggle bracket, and now we have an HTML text that comes out of here that has the right value for title. It's going to come down to inspector, and if I go over here, this is the one that I just showed you on the slide. It's going to pull the output of title, so that squiggle bracket's replaced, and then this time it's going to look for inspector, and then it's going to replace this with the inspector item from dynamic content, which is going to be on get item inspection. Since inspector is a person, I'm going to use their display name because I want their name, but you could also get their email or their department, job title, whatever you want. You can pull all of this stuff from a user, and you could have all of that in the report if you wanted to. So again, I went from HTML content to title and changed 1 field, and then I took the output of that and I changed the second field, and I bet you can guess I'm going down to the next one and I'm going to do the third thing. And when I run this flow, I'm going to show you what this output looks like on here so that it makes more sense. I'll tell you I spent a lot of time troubleshooting these various solutions and reading the output on them. So you will run into this when you're building your own because there are lots of moving pieces. But again, I chained it. I chained from HTML to title to inspector in my 1 item. And if you look back at the beginning of this, it's the same replace, only it's looking at the output of the inspector, and it's looking for the issue 1 brackets, and it's going to replace it with that item 1 value. And since this was a choice field in SharePoint, so you can't just have item 1. It has to be actually the value of item 1 and not the field. So if I look over here, see item 1, that won't work. It needs to be what's inside item 1 because it's a choice field, item 1 value. So doing this, no matter how many fields you have on here, will eventually get you a completed HTML file or HTML text, I would say, that has all of your data filled into it. Let me double. Are we good on time? I have no idea. Yes, we are. Okay, great. So after that happens, what we want to do with that text is we want to create a real HTML file in OneDrive from it. So this is that temporary folder that I told you about earlier. You can see I have it stored in my virtual marathon HTML temp folder in OneDrive. I'm always giving it the same name because I'm actually going to delete it after the fact, so I give it a file name. It's very important that that file name ends with .html, because if it's not a .html file, the flow won't read it and it won't work. And the contents are the output of whatever your last compose was. So this is my completed HTML text, gets saved as an HTML file inside OneDrive. And so now we've got a temporary file. We know if we went and looked at that HTML file that's in OneDrive, it would look like our report. It would be a web page version of our report, and it would be complete, but we want it to be a PDF. So we're now going to use, it's called convert file. It's a preview action that works on OneDrive, and you can actually change, there's different file types now. You can actually convert it into multiple kinds of files. But we're just going to convert the file using the ID of the dynamic content from the create file HTML temp. So ID right here. So that's going to make our template and do a PDF file, but that doesn't actually make the PDF file for you. It just makes the code for it. You still have to put it somewhere. So I'm going to use a create file. And again, I'm putting it in SharePoint, but you could put it in OneDrive if you wanted to. I made a create file in SharePoint and the address. It puts it in my individual PDFs report, and it ends with .pdf. Whatever file name you're going to give it, whether dynamic, static, whatever, needs to end with .pdf for the same reason the previous one needed to end in .html. And then the file content is going to be the file content of the conversion action. So all of this stuff chains together, and it makes sense. So at the end of this, you should have a PDF in SharePoint, and then I like to do a delete file on that temporary HTML. So if I go to delete file, my ID is going to be that create file HTML temp ID, so that I end up back with a nice clean empty folder in my OneDrive. Okay, so I'm going to show you how that runs, and I'm going to pause real quick to answer questions. So if I go to my inspection form, again, I used a manual trigger on this for this reason. I'm going to do one that has no signature in it first. So I'm just going to select this and use my automate button. And I'm going to use inspection PDF, no signature. It's going to ask me for some confirmations. That's one of the reasons why you may want to automate this instead of using manual. It doesn't ask for a confirmation if it does it automatically. But I'm going to go ahead and let it run. And then I'm going to go back to my flow. Hopefully it's running. And I'm going to give you a very quick overview of what happens so that you can see what's going on in the background. Because once you understand how these building blocks work, you can make this so much more advanced and you can do all kinds of neat reports with it. Once you know this part, the rest of the stuff that I'm telling you about is going to be much easier, except for the pen input stuff. So this is still running. It's finished. It ran successfully. And I'm just very quickly going to go through. You can see it gets information. It spits it out. This is all the stuff that we have. Right, I've got my information. We just know that it works. If this errors out, then you have to figure out why did it error out. Troubleshooting flow is always fun. If you've never troubleshooted a flow before, troubleshot, I don't know. This is where you do that. You go to the runs and it tells you everything that happens. You don't have to be a developer or anything to know. It's pretty straightforward what this stuff means. This is the report title that I made. It put in a date, the operator name, and that no signature text that I put in there. Get file content. This is the part that I want to show you because this is my template that I used. It went to go find it. It found it. This is what it found. Look at that. It's just that HTML that I made right there. This variable is going to show the same thing, right? That's what the value is. It's exactly the same as the previous action. My title, it shows you the input and the output. You can see that the title now says inspection, but it had title up here. That means this worked. Okay, but then if I go into the next one, my inputs are going to come in here, and you can see now it put in the second one, but it pulled the previous one first. If I make this second compose look at the HTML, the get HTML file, I'll lose this first value. So you always have to make sure that you daisy chain these together correctly. If you skip one of these composes, you'll miss your field. I've seen that happen a lot of times on this solution. So just make sure when you're doing the compose that you're always going from the one above to the one below until you get to the bottom. So now I've got 2. Now I've got all 3 of them filled out. I've created my HTML file. You can see this is what it spits out as. It looks just like HTML, only my values are in there. And then I convert it. Convert's not really going to show us anything. It just kind of shows us this stuff. Then I go to my create file, which is, again, not going to show us anything we can super read other than we know where to go find it. And then it deleted the file successfully, so my temp file is gone. If I go to the library that I pushed it in, individual PDFs, there's that report that I just made. And I click on it, and look, here it is. It's not very pretty. I didn't put anything fancy in it. But again, if I was a web designer and I'm good at HTML and styling, it could very well show up. I could make colors and headings and all kinds of neat things in there. I'm going to pause for like...
Nick, we have got a couple of questions for you.
Yep.
So we have an anonymous question for, can we use SharePoint all the way instead of OneDrive?
You need OneDrive for the convert file function action. So you cannot do it without OneDrive because of this action right here, convert file, can only be done from OneDrive right now. So you could ignore SharePoint and do everything in OneDrive, or you could do like I did where you only use OneDrive for this one piece, but you do need it. Good question. Okay. Could you add attachments? Yes and no. What I'm going to show you next with the pen input would work for attachments, especially if they're like images. You'll be able to do that. If they're other PDFs, you'd have to convert from PDF to HTML, which you can also do with this, I believe. I'd have to double check if you could do PDF to HTML. I know you can do to HTML. Yeah, I think you'd have to go backwards to mash a PDF into another PDF if that's what they're trying to do. But if you have image attachments or text files or anything, you could absolutely put in another action that gets the content out of that attachment file and pushes that in there too. Okay. And then the rest of them on there were just about where to get the slide deck, and those were already answered. Can you permission control down to the field level? Yes and no. If you use Power Apps, you can kind of do some trickery on that. I wouldn't recommend it. You don't want to use, you can't really use field level permissions in SharePoint without custom development. In Power Apps, you can lock down certain fields in certain ways, or you could even have multiple Power Apps that do different things. Like if you want one person, they enter these 5 questions, and then the inspector has to come in there and they have to go sign off on it. You can do that. You can have multiple people involved, and they can have multiple Power Apps or multiple forms, or a 2-step process, or an email approval. There's a lot of things that can be done in there, and I've actually done several different variations of that using these building blocks. So you'd have to do some other digging, but you can absolutely do that kind of thing if that's what you're trying to stop. If you're trying to stop your users from filling in information that they shouldn't, use separate Power Apps. Make one for your users and make one for your admins. Like I made one that was someone would come fill in a request, and I want 50 business cards, and they would come fill out the request form in Power Apps, and then an approver comes in and they have an approver Power App, and they go in and they're like, oh, here's a request, and they mark that off. So there's multiple ways to do that piece of it and still have the output of this report. Good questions. Okay, so hopefully everyone understood that piece of it, because we're going to get a little bit more complicated now. Let's go into the next thing.
And Nick, just before you move on, we had one more question come in.
Sure.
Can we send PDF as email instead of loading it to SharePoint?
Absolutely. So you could temporarily create it in that OneDrive in the same temp folder and then email it and delete it. And most of the situations where I'm building these, they keep them in SharePoint and send them out, because a lot of these safety inspections, they have like an external governing agency that has to get them. So we can even, I'm going to actually talk about that at the end of this. There are even decisions that can be made on who gets the emails at the end of it. So I think you still need to do the create file somewhere, but it doesn't have to permanently stay anywhere. Or you could just put the text directly in an email if you don't want it as a PDF. Actually, I think you can do yeah, I would temporarily put it somewhere regardless. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about before we jump into the signature, one thing that has come up a few times is, what if they go back to the form and they update it? Will it update that report again? Not necessarily, because if you're date stamping the report each time it makes it, it's going to make a new report, which will have a new name, so you're going to get duplicate reports. To get around that, I didn't do that on my demo, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit. If you use the same name always, it just overwrites the previous one. That's very easy. If you use a different name, what I like to do is in SharePoint create an additional field in the list, or actually in this list, in the PDF list, and it would be called like data ID or something like this. I'll just make it a text. It doesn't really matter what kind of field it is. It can be a number, it can be a text. We'll just call this data ID. And what we do there is we set whatever the item ID is from the inspection form, so that I would know that item 1 matches this report. And then within the flow, before I make a new report, I can first look for the old one, delete it, and then make a new report. I don't have a whole lot of time to go in depth in how that works, but it's basically a get items with a filter on it that can find that ID and delete it and not delete the other ones. So if you have a question about that, you can hit me up on Twitter or something, and I might be able to help you with that. But it is a hurdle that you may have to get over, but it's easy enough to solve. Okay, so that's how you deal with updates. Now I want to show you some actual demo. Pen inputs. A lot of people like having signatures on their Power Apps. That's one of the ways that you can, that's one of the benefits to using that over forms or something like that. So to do that, we're just going to slightly modify that HTML template that I showed you earlier. We're going to slightly modify the Power App, which I've already done, so you've already seen it, but I'm going to show you what we did to it. And then we're going to, again, slightly modify our flows, just a couple more actions. So first, I'm going to show you what we did to the HTML template. No, that's not what I want to do. You can see it's almost identical to the point where I actually just copied and pasted the same slide from before, but it has one new piece. So all of this is the same, but right here in this purple box, I added this image tag, img src, that's image source. And when you're using HTML, it's image source equals, and then you point to a file. It's going to be, you know, image source, blah, 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 picture.jpg. It doesn't work that well. It doesn't work that straightforward with what we're doing here. There's a little bit more trickery, but all we have to do on the HTML side is add a field for it. You can see I put a signature heading above it in bold where it just says signature. So my report should ultimately just say signature, and then right below that will be their actual signature. Okay, so let me show you what that. So let's go to the Power App, and I'm just going to go through this real quick. I'm just get the bullet points up here. But I'm going to show you what we did. We added a pen input. So on my Power App, I've got a pen input that is, if you go to insert, it's under input, pen input. So that's right here. And then I created a variable to hold the signature. And I'm going to show you how that works so you can see it. First, I actually made two buttons on here. I have one called set signature and one called submit, but you really only need one button. My submit button does both things. But what set signature does is I've got a variable. This is the part that matters. I have that on a slide too that I'm going to show you. And there's a Shane Young video on this that is great, by the way. That's how I learned how to do this in the first place, and it's taken some tweaking to get to work how I want it. But you're essentially running two set functions on select on a button. It doesn't have to be in a button. You can do it other different ways. But I have a variable called var signature, and I'm using this function called JSON that you use in Power Apps that looks at, you can see inside the parentheses, that's JSON. In fact, let me bring up the slide to show you it a little bit easier. I've got it color coded. So you're using two set commands that run on the button click. I'm setting a signature. What am I setting the signature to? I'm setting it to this JSON function of pen input dot image, comma, JSON format include binary data. I know that's a whole lot to go over if you're not a developer. I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but essentially that's going to pull a bunch of code back from that pen input. The code that it pulls back has some stuff at the beginning that tells you what kind of code it is. Flow does not care about that. So the second set takes that variable and then sets it to itself minus 24 characters, because that stuff at the beginning is 24 characters. Again, watch Shane Young's video on how to do that. He explains why he did that and he shows you both steps. But this is the function that you need to do this. So I'm just setting a variable to whatever is in that pen input box. Let me show you how that runs. I'm going to go ahead and run this form. Up here, if I fill this in, put in my name. That's not how my name's spelled. Put my name in there, pass, and I'm going to draw a signature in here. If I'm doing it on a tablet, you can write it, whatever. And I'm going to set my signature, which is going to run that command that I just showed you. And look at that. It puts all this stuff in here. Okay, great. That doesn't look like a signature. That's not useful at all. It's not. So what I did after that is a couple different things. So let me close out of this. I want to show you what my submit button does too. My submit button is almost the same thing. If I go here, you can see the same set stuff in here. Only I also added some stuff at the bottom to submit the form to SharePoint and reset everything. But that's kind of standard. So one button does everything. As soon as I fill that out, I click the submit button. It pulls my pen input and it pushes everything into SharePoint. And inside SharePoint, okay, so let me see what, okay, so now I've got Power Automate. Power Automate's actually going to do the heavy lifting here before SharePoint. Okay. All right, so these are the steps that you're going to take. Sounds like a lot of steps. So I'm going to show it to you inside Power Automate. Some of these are not necessary. I created a signature image library in SharePoint. You can skip that stuff completely. I just wanted to show you that you can do it. So if I go to my inspection demo form, let me check my time again. We're good. Okay, great. I'm going to go real fast though. You can see I'm pushing that code into signature code. It looks the same. It's not a signature. So if I go to my flow, I'm basically doing the same beginning steps as before, only I'm making a file name for a signature because I'm keeping it as an image. Again, you don't have to do this one or this piece. I'm going to create a signature image. And what I did is I used the create file. It takes the file name from whatever you want to name it, or you can just give it a static name. It doesn't matter. And then the file content is signature code, which that's just what the field name. I'm just pulling the field name from SharePoint and it'll make a file. So if I go back over here to signature images, This is one I ran earlier. It stores just the signature, right? That's not very helpful, but some people might want to keep that. What if you want to manually? What if you need to forge somebody's signature later? You could do that. So maybe don't do that if you don't want forgeries to happen. So I created a signature image, and then you could do this directly. You could pull that information that I just showed you directly from the SharePoint list or directly from Power Apps to do what I'm about to do. But instead, I'm pulling from an image file, because you could do this with any image file, not just these signatures. If you want to put an attachment image into your form like someone asked earlier, you could do that using the same thing. I've got a variable called image URI, and it has a function in there that is important. And I want to say, no, I didn't put it in here. I wanted to say I put it in here, but I guess I did not. There is a function called data URI that will convert that code from the data URI from the image, from get file content. It'll convert that into something that the PDF will read. I tried to take file path originally and push that into my HTML, but basically I'm using this to get the code that our HTML template later will use. And then the rest of it's the same. Look, this is identical to the previous one that we just went through. Here's my composes, just like before, only I have, I got a bad network quality error. Hopefully everyone can still hear me. My compose, I've added one more for signature, and it works just like the other ones, only I'm replacing the signature squiggle lines or squiggle brackets with the variable. Okay, that's all I did. Everything else is identical to the previous one that we made. So let me go run that really quick, and then I'm going to very quickly show you how to do the final one and go.
Nick, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. You're so close to the end and we've not got very long left, but we are getting some reports of some issues on hearing you. Perhaps it could be a video quality. Would you mind turning your video off just to improve that?
Yeah, not a problem. Yeah, I see I'm getting network errors. Can you hear me now?
I can still hear you. It'll be 30 seconds before we'll know.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to run the one that does with signature just to show that it runs. I'm going to let it make a report. It does all of the same stuff as before. The only difference is that it adds the signature at the end. If I go into the individual PDFs, okay, I'm having network issues. Now I'll have one when it finishes that has a signature at the bottom of it. There it goes, with signature. And you can see it put the signature in at the bottom. And you can do that again with any image. All right, I'm going to go real fast through the rest of this. Summary reports work almost the same way. You need the same things to do it as before. The HTML template's a little bit different. I don't have a HTML or body tag. I just have a middle section. I made a table here. You don't have to make a table. You can do it just like before where you just have items. But you can see I still just have a heading and a squiggle bracket that I want to replace for each item. And at the end, I put a horizontal rule so that there'll be a horizontal rule separating each item. This is basically my loop that we're going to go through. Okay, so that's what my HTML template looks like. And then inside Power Automate, I will show you how that works really quick. Okay, inside Power Automate, it does the same thing, but I triggered it manually, but you could do a scheduled trigger or some other trigger instead. But instead of getting one item, I'm using get items. I'm getting every item from the inspection form. I'm setting a variable for report date because I want to put a date at the top of my report. I'm setting a variable for list items. And this variable is going to be what we build our HTML with to convert at the end. And if you notice, here's all my beginning stuff, HTML, head, body. I've got my report date. So all the stuff that's only going to show up once at the top, I put at the top. And then in apply to each, for each item, I take the value of the item. For each item, get that item, just like we did before. Our loop is going to be almost identical to what we did with a single item. So I'm getting an item. I'm getting the HTML template. I'm using my composes, right? I'm creating a temp file. I'm getting content from it. So this is where, so I got my temp file. Instead of converting my temp file, I'm going to get the information from it, and I'm going to put it at the end of my variable using the append to string variable. What that means is all that HTML stuff is going to go at the bottom of this. So it's going to loop through and just keep adding HTML below whatever was above it. So we're ultimately going to get one long HTML template that has a section in the middle for each item, right? So that's what this does. It appends to the variable. It'll go through every item that you have in your list, and it'll deletes the temp files as it makes it. And then once you've gone through all of your items, once I've hit every item that was in my list, it will, sorry, let me get rid of that. It will append the bottom stuff. Look at that, I'm adding a slash body and a slash HTML at the end. So now I have one big block of HTML, and I'm just going to do the same stuff that I did before. I create a file, only my file content is whatever this variable is, list items. I'm going to convert file just like before. I'm going to create a file just like before, and I'm going to delete the temp files just like before. How does that look how does that look in process? I can again pick a random item. It doesn't matter because I'm manually kicking it off, but you would schedule it or do something like that instead. I'm going to run my all items report. And it basically is just going to loop through and build that for you. You can see it's running right now. Gets items, gets all of the items. You can see it's going to list all of the items. And here's the loop. The loop takes a minute to go through. The more items that you have in there, the longer the loop. So you may want to add some filtering on there, only show certain items. You could do that later. Ooh, it failed. One of my items it didn't like. Yeah, it didn't like one of the things that I did. But this was working before, I promise. So it just loops through these. Sometimes you might get a failure on one of them, but troubleshoot it. It will loop through these, and luckily I think I have one kept from before, I hope. Yeah, I do. So I had one before, it loops through it. It uses the same process, and you can see here that it put a report date at the top. I didn't have one to put in there, but you can see it goes through each item. I only had 2 when I ran this, but it would go through every item in the list and just make this section in the middle and put it into a PDF. All right, I'm going to go through the last couple slides because we're almost done, and then I'll have a little bit of time for questions. So that's how you build the all reports, the summary reports. In the real world, I've not seen as many use cases for that, but I bet you guys can think of a few. Mostly they like the individual items. Okay, so now I want to talk about some possible enhancements that you could do to this. You could create different report types. You could have multiple HTML templates for a given item and have it where, for example, forklift inspection versus conveyor belt inspection. And if you click that drop down on a Power App, the flow sees it and it does different things. Maybe it uses a different HTML template. So you could feasibly have multiple different types of reports being built by the same flow. Or you could use a switch condition. That's one I did recently where they have, if this object, if this field has this value, use a switch condition to show use this HTML template and email it to this governing body at the end. So there are a lot of things you can do around these building blocks once you have the core functionality working. That makes it a lot easier. If you've got any basic flow knowledge, once you have the PDF conversion and you know how to read your data and you know how to loop through it using the apply to each, you can add all kinds of other things to it. So that is all I have. I'm going to use the few minutes we have left to answer any questions that are up there. Let me see if there are any. I'm sure there are. Let's see.
We actually don't have any new questions. You've been addressing them as you go along. Well done.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I see the Shane Young one. Yep. Okay, great. So yeah, that is all I have. If you want, you're welcome to have these last 5 minutes back. You can find me on Twitter at Brattoli, or take a look at the slide deck that will be shared. You should be able to follow that guide. Again, all of the pieces to this that I showed you, there is content around there. I learned a lot of this by messing with it myself, plus looking at other people's stuff. So Shane Young, Laura Rogers, some of the other people that are talking today, you can learn more of those pieces, but it's out there. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me or review some of the stuff that's already there. Thanks, everybody.